Is there sound now? Is there sound now?
But it's from Nikon.
No.
Now.
Oh, it's from the Nikon.
Yeah.
Is there sound now?
It's very bad quality.
Okay. So, I see.
We need
So
to
we
find
turn
the
there.
and find Samsung. This one, yes.
Okay. And that's it?
Must be.
Should be.
And
Can you have a...
I'll check now.
Yeah, please.
just decrease it a little bit. On it for Facebook, it's okay.
Can you hear me on Facebook?
I'm just going on to your name now.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Okay, all right. Sorry, devotees. Many challenges. It must be the material world, I think. I suspect. Okay, all right, here we go. Here we go again. So, right. So I said I would watch over the books and things. He said, excuse me. He walked up the aisle, and surprisingly, he walked up on the stage. And it was the man I'd come to hear, Swami Bhaktivedanta. Krishna. Because he's got no one to introduce him except himself. Prabhupada, struggling alone. Okay. He walked up on the stage and introduced himself to the people and tried to get them to come forward. He said, come forward, come forward. A few of them came up to the front. They were mixed couples, many Indians, male and female, mostly middle-aged and some college-aged. A lot of professor types and ladies were there. Then he began his speech. He dove right into it. He just started exclaiming, proclaiming the greatness of the Creator, and that the most important thing is to remember the Creator and remember God. He began to expand on God consciousness, what God consciousness is, and how God is everywhere, and how it behooves us all to remember God, no matter what we call him, what names we call him by, but that we should call him. He gave a demonstration which was very moving. He chanted Hare Krishna, Hare Rama, and spoke about the power and saving grace in the mantra. He took a little break about halfway through and had some water. The last thing he said as he was coming down from the podium was that he had copies of the Srimad Bhagavatam. He explained that he'd been working on them and that they came in 3 volumes and were $16. Then he concluded and came down. A lot of people went over to him. Some were timid, some were enthusiastic. Some people shook his hand and were asking for books. At first there were about 15 people gathered around him, talking to him and asking questions. With so many people around, he came over to me and said, "Sir, would you do me one more favor? Will you kindly take over the selling of the books? people will be coming to you for the books. So you sell the books and put the money in this little box, and I'll be with you in a minute." I said, "Fine." So while he talked to the people, others came up to me. They must have thought I was somehow his secretary or his traveling companion. And people were coming over to me and asking me personal questions about him, which I couldn't really answer because I didn't know. Some people were buying the books or looking through them. So this went on, and I was trying to listen to him carry on his conversations with people, and carry on the book selling at the same time. Some of the people were looking for a guru and trying to find out what he was supposed to be. Some of them were really interrogating him, but he just smiled and answered all their questions simply. I remember he told me, "You will know, there's no pressure. You will know if I'm your guru." He suggested that people go over and read the books. And then the group dwindled down to about half a dozen. And the few remaining were just looking at him, and some were too timid to approach him. He walked over to them and spoke to them, putting them at ease. Later he came over and we counted the collection, and I helped him pack up his box and carry downstairs the boxes of books that were left. As we parted, he thanked me very much, and I gave him my name and address and phone number and purchased a set of the Srimad Bhagavatam. Wow. So chapter 15. It will not be possible to assist you. So we begin with just a very short excerpt from a letter to Sumati Maharaji. "I have come here in this old age, neither for sightseeing nor for any personal interest. It is for the interest of the entire humanity that I'm trying to implement the science of Krishna, which will actually make them happy. So it is the duty of every devotee of Lord Krishna to help me by all means." This is from a letter by Srila Prabhupada to Sumati Maharaji. November passed and December came, and Prabhupada, having obtained an extension on his visa, stayed on. America seemed so opulent, yet many things were difficult to tolerate. The sirens and bells from fire engines and police cars seemed like they would crack his heart. Sometimes at night he would hear a person being attacked and crying for help. From his first days in the city, he had noted that the smell of dog stool was everywhere. And although it was such a rich city, he could rarely find a mango to purchase, and if he did, it was very expensive and usually had no taste. From his room, he would sometimes hear the horns of ocean liners, and he would dream that someday he would sail around the world with a Sankirtan party, preaching in all the major cities of the world. The weather went below freezing. The weather went below freezing, colder than he'd ever experienced in India. Daily he had to walk toward the Hudson, the river, against a west wind that even on an ordinary winter's day would take your breath away and make your eyes water and your face grow numb. On a stormy day, the driving wind and sudden gusts could even knock a man down. Sometimes a cold rain would turn the streets slick with ice. The cold would become especially severe as one approached the shelterless, wind-swept area of West Side Drive, where occasional whirlwinds carried brown leaves and paper trash mysteriously high into the air. Srila Prabhupada wore a coat Dr. Mishra had given him, but he never gave up wearing his dhoti despite the cold, windy walks. Swami Nikhilananda of the Ramakrishna Mission had advised Prabhupada that if he wanted to stay in the West, he should abandon his traditional Indian dress and strict vegetarianism. Meat eating and liquor, as well as pants and coat, were almost a necessity in this climate, he had said. Before Prabhupada had left India, one of his godbrothers had demonstrated to him how he should eat in the West with a knife and fork. But Prabhupada never considered taking on Western ways. His advisors cautioned him not to remain an alien, but to get into the spirit of American life, even if it meant breaking vows he'd held in India. Almost all Indian immigrants compromised their old ways. But Prabhupada's idea was different, and he could not be budged. The others may have had to compromise, he thought, but they had come to beg technological knowledge from the West. I have not come to beg something, he said, but to give something. In his solitary wanderings, Srila Prabhupada made acquaintances with a number of local people. There was Mr. Rubin, a Turkish Jew, who worked as a New York City subway conductor. Mr. Rubin met Prabhupada on a park bench, and being a sociable fellow and a world traveler, sat and talked with the Indian holy man, Mr. Rubin. He seemed to know that he would have temples filled up with devotees. He would look out and say, I'm not a poor man, I'm rich. There are temples and books. They're existing, they're there. But the time is separating us from them. He always mentioned we and spoke about the one who sent him, his spiritual master. He didn't know people at the time, but he said, I'm never alone. He always looked like a lonely man to me. That's what made me think of him like a holy man, Elijah, who always went out alone. I don't believe he had any followers, unquote. When the weather was not rainy or icy, Prabhupada would catch the bus to Grand Central Station and visit the Central Library on 42nd Street. His Srimad Bhagavatams were there, some of the same volumes he'd sold to the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi, and he took pleasure in seeing them listed in the card catalogue and learning that they were being regularly checked out and read. He would sometimes walk through United Nations Plaza or walk up to New India House on 64th Street, where he had met Mr. Malhotra, a consulate officer. It was through Mr. Malhotra that he had contacted the Tagore Society and had secured an invitation to lecture before one of their meetings back in November. Riding the bus down Fifth Avenue, he would look out at the buildings and imagine that someday they could be used in Krishna consciousness. He would take a special interest in certain buildings, one on 23rd Street and one with a dome on 14th Street. Attracted his attention. He would think of how the materialists had constructed such elaborate buildings and had yet made no provisions for spiritual life. Despite all the great achievements of technology, the people felt empty and useless. They had built these great buildings, but the children were going to LSD. Hare Krishna. Okay. Just a little bit more. December the 2nd, New York Times headlines. New York City hospitals report marked rise in LSD cases admitted for care. Protest against U.S. participation in Vietnam War mounts. The weather grew cold, but there was no snow in December. On Columbus Avenue, shops were selling Christmas trees, and the Continental restaurants were bright with holiday lighting. On 72nd, the Retailers Association erected tall red poles topped with green tinsel Christmas trees. The tops of the trees on both sides of the street sprouted tinsel garlands that spanned the street and joined in red tinsel stars surrounded by colored lights. Although Srila Prabhupada did no Christmas shopping, he visited many bookstores. Orientalia, Samwise's Doubleday, the Paragon, and others, trying to sell his Srimad Bhagavatams. Mrs. Ferber, the wife of the Paragon Book Gallery proprietor, considered Prabhupada, quote, a pleasant and extremely polite small gentleman, unquote. The first time he called, she wasn't interested in his books, but he tried again, and she took several volumes. Prabhupada used to stop by about once a week, and since his books were selling regularly, he would collect. Sometimes when he needed copies to sell personally, he would come by and pick them up from Mrs. Ferber, and sometimes he would phone to ask her how his books were selling. Mrs. Ferber, every time he came, he would ask for a glass of water. If a customer would make such a request, I would ordinarily say, there is the water cooler. But because he was an old man, I couldn't tell him that, of course. He was very polite always, very modest, and a great scholar. So whenever he would ask, I would fetch him a cup of water personally. Once, Prabhupada was talking with Mrs. Ferber about Indian cuisine, and she mentioned that she especially liked samosas. The next time he paid her a visit, he brought a tray of samosas, which she enjoyed. Hare Krishna. Okay. All right, devotees, we will continue on from this point, the point of a tray of samosas. Hare Krishna. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.